Will the US talk to Iran? Donald Trump says he was about to strike Iran after the downing of a US drone, then backed off, fearing a loss of life. But is the US president being serious, or is he ramping up the pressure on Tehran? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobbie. Now, the United States called off a military strike on Iran at the last minute. It's a move that might not sit well with regional allies. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Israel want President Donald Trump to keep up its tough stance against Tehran. We'll go to our panel in a moment, but first, Fintan Moynihan has more on this standoff in the Gulf and Trump's strategy of maximum pressure.
It was the airstrike that never was. According to President Donald Trump, the US was 10 minutes away from attacking Iran, but pulled back in the final moments.
I said, you know what? They shot down an unmanned drone, plane, whatever you want to call it. And here we are sitting with 150 dead people. That would have taken place probably within a half an hour after I said, go ahead. Yeah. And I didn't like it. I didn't think it was proportionate.
The planned strikes were a response to Iran's downing of an American surveillance drone. Iran has also said it's exercising restraint.
At the same moment when the aircraft was being tracked, another spy aircraft called P-8 was flying close to this drone. That aircraft is manned and has around 35 crew members. Well, we could have targeted that plane. It was our right to do so. And yes, it was American, but we didn't do it. We hit the unmanned aircraft.
But the aborted U.S. airstrike may have been about more than retaliation. The U.S. is hoping that pressure on Iran will convince its leaders to renegotiate its nuclear deal with world powers.
Our maximum pressure campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran is working. Iran is feeling the effects of our maximum pressure campaign. Iran is responsible for the escalating tensions in the region, and they continue to reject diplomatic overtures to de-escalate tensions in the region.
It's a strategy Trump has tried before. In August 2017, he promised North Korea fire and fury in response to their nuclear tests. Less than a year later, he was shaking Kim Jong-un's hand in Singapore. But in the Middle East, regional allies are pushing for the U.S. to act against Iran. Saudi Arabia blames Tehran for attacks on shipping in the Gulf of Oman and supplying weapons used by Yemen's Houthi rebels to attack Saudi territory. At a gathering of regional leaders last month, the Saudi king called for decisive action to stop what he called Iranian escalations. Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, a longtime opponent of Iran and the nuclear deal, is also pushing the U.S. to take a strong position. While conflict was averted this time, tension is still high, and there appears to be little room for compromise. Fintan Moynihan, Al Jazeera.
Here we go. Let's introduce our panel today. Joining us from Tehran, Hassan Ahmadian, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Tehran. From Oxford in the UK, Helen Lackner, a Research Associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And from Kuwait City, Abdullah Al Shayji, Professor of Political Science at Kuwait University. Welcome to you all. Hassan Ahmadian in Tehran. Where does all this leave US relations with its key allies across the region?
Well, I think the U.S. allies in the region are basically pushing the United States into a sort of military confrontation with Iran, which is basically based on the premise that any conflict with Iran would set it back for years or decades. And I think that is really a miscalculation that can lead to a regional conflict that can destabilize the entire region. They are not basically taking into account Iran's, traditional strategic behavior in the region. It won't act alone. It will act within an alliance, and it won't go for war or conflict all alone. I think it has a coalition of state and non-state actors that can, trigger a regional conflict. So I think this premise that the Saudis, Israelis, and UAE are seeing that basically is a win-win situation in which a pushback against Iran within the maximum pressure would diminish its regional reach and influence, or on another side, a military confrontation can even more devastate Tehran, is really unrealistic. It is underestimating Iran's capabilities in terms of military and asymmetric warfares in the region. And I think Iran wouldn't have anything to lose if it's to be faced with a regional an international hostility by the United States and its allies. So I think they are pushing the United States to that direction. But up until now, fortunately, the United States has rationally so decided not to, escalate things even further. But we are on an escalatory road for now.
Helen Lackner in Oxford. We may be on an escalatory road so far, but in equal measure, did or do the three allies we're talking about, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the UAE, in equal measure, did they want Donald Trump to do something yesterday?
I suspect that they probably did. I think the first thing to remind everybody of is that we're really in an extremely dangerous and risky situation, and that we're yet again in a situation where some politicians who have specific objectives are completely neglecting and ignoring the likely consequences of their actions over thousands, if not millions, of people in the relevant countries. I think for the Gulf states and Israel, they are aware of the fact that Trump has already started on his election manifesto for next year, and that their window of opportunity for really attacking Iran is narrowing by the day. So I suspect that they were pretty much disappointed by what happened yesterday. I also think it's important to remember that a few strikes are not something that will just happen with no consequences. I think our previous speaker has explained that there will be very serious consequences. I think it's very clear to the populations in those countries that it's not a matter of simply getting the Americans to have a few airstrikes, or even themselves getting involved in airstrikes. If a conflict starts, it will be, or worsens, because I think to some extent it's already started, it will be a disaster for everybody concerned in the region. And again, this is thousands of miles away from the US. The US only have to worry about their 15, 20 or 30,000 troops in the region, whereas everybody else has to worry about everybody in their countries.
Abdullah Al Shayji in Kuwait City. Is this now less than maximum pressure? Because that's the buzzword, that's the key phrase we've been hearing now from the Trump administration as far as those allies are concerned for a long time now.
Well, if you allow me, first of all, nobody could push United States around to do what the United States doesn't believe it serves its national interest. Neither the Saudis nor the Emiratis or other nations, probably with the exception of Israel, which has an axe to grind with the Iranians to be the only sole owner of the nuclear power in the region. Nobody could push the United States, whether it's Trump or any other administration. This is number one. Number two, there won't be a wide-scale war. I mean, President Trump stated it very clear, and I'm glad he called off the strike, even though it was a very limited strike, a retaliatory tactical one, and not a full-scale war, because Trump, the last thing he wants to be to own another major conflict in the Middle East that could really reduces his chances to be re-elected in 2020. So he's a very smart, calculating president, and he doesn't want to push the envelope all the way to full-scale war. Iran, on the other hand, is a very rational actor model, and it has really dealt with this crisis in a very, in a very appropriate manner. It's now on the driver's seat. The Americans have really looked shabby. The allies in the region are now wondering once again In a study I just finished, there is a trust deficit building up between the GCC allies and the US administration, whether it was Obama who struck a deal with the Iranians behind our backs without us knowing, or whether it's Trump with the GCC crisis, or now flip-flopping over the Iranian threat or escalation or de-escalation. On the final point that I'd like to raise at this stage is that the Iranians know that if their proxies will really get involved in a wide-scale war, then they will be hammered badly also, and the Iranians would also be hammered. So the deterrence issue is not really working. The maximum pressure that the US has been implementing against the Iranians for the last 13 months is not really working. Now cooler heads have to prevail, I think. There has to be a wiggle room for the Iranians, and there has to be a face-saving approach for the Americans to strike a deal or a compromise or a mediation through the Iraqis, through the Europeans, to have the Americans give the Europeans some leeways through their companies to do some limited deals with the Iranians as a show of good faith and a confidence-building measure, and that could really build up to de-escalate the situation and to start again with another nuclear deal that the Iranians could be enticed in. You cannot just push the Iranians with all sticks and no carrots. This policy of maximum pressure has to be re-evaluated away from the ideologue and the hawks on both sides of the aisle, and then you can talk about real de-escalation, not a seasonal one.
Okay, Hassan in Tehran, let's stay with that idea of wriggle room here. Is there a little bit of breathing space, and I mean this in a positive sense, for the government in Tehran, in as much as what we're talking about here is 6 monarchies, all of whom, all those royal households have worries about Tehran, but they're not on the same page. The GCC has been split for the best part of 2 years now.
Of course, they are not on the same page on Iran. I mean, Oman and Kuwait and especially Qatar nowadays, they are, different than the hawks in the GCC. And I think the hawks are the ones who are trying, though I agree with Abdullah that they can't really set the agenda for the US administration, but they are trying to do that. And I think they are pushing the Trump administration along with the hawks in Washington to climb a tree that he eventually can't come down from. So he would be in a situation in which a war with Iran would diminish his chances for a second term, and silence vis-a-vis the escalation in the region also can harm his reputation. I think this is the calculus there. The warmongers that were there during the invasion of Iraq are still in Washington on the call and pushing the United States, the president, to do something about Iran. I think they have a very good partners in Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, Bibi Netanyahu. They are, as Zarif says, the B team that is pushing towards war. I think their miscalculation can lead the entire region into chaos and destabilization. I think it can also harm the global economy as well by oil shocks, and we've seen that 6% the 6% rise of the oil prices as a result of a single incident. You can imagine how a war can translate into a chaos in the economic sphere and the oil prices and everything. Okay. So I think they are pushing the United States towards a more irrational policy towards Iran. I think that can have really catastrophic consequences regionally and internationally.
Clearly, Helen, in Oxford, this would have economically a massive impact if Donald Trump does do something that he backed away from doing 36 hours ago now. For you, Helen, how will this be being discussed in Riyadh? And is this a humiliation for Mohammed bin Salman? Because there is this compelling triangular relationship, isn't there, between Donald Trump, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, the Middle East peace plan, which we are reportedly being told we will learn about at the end of this month when there's that big conference in Bahrain, and the Crown Prince.
Well, first I'd like to say one quick thing relating to what was said earlier, which is that the US administration is not unified. I mean, it's very clear that Trump does not want a war. But I think it's equally clear that when we're dealing with people like Pompeo and Bolton, that they do want a war. And they are people for whom, an Armageddon is not bad news. It's something that they and the most extremist religious groups in that part of the world, would actually look forward to. So I think that's one element that we need to take into consideration. I think on the issue of the relationship between MBS and Trump and Jared Kushner, my recent thoughts on this topic is that really the relationship is directly between Trump and MBS, and they have extremely similar personalities and approaches and ways of looking at the world, and that they actually don't need the mediation of Jared Kushner in between them. My understanding about the Glorious Peace Plan is that it's now not going to be announced until after the next Israeli elections, that the economic plan in Bahrain, which is probably going to be quite a bit of a fiasco, is going to be discussing, economic aspects without looking at the political aspects. And my understanding is that certainly none of the Palestinian organizations or most of the Palestinian business people, or indeed most Arab and other business people, are not willing to discuss these issues until and unless they have something that looks like a Middle East peace plan, which has some relationship to what was originally proposed by King Abdullah almost 20 years ago now, which basically it's a famous and notorious two-state solution, with Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine, which has been basically carved up and destroyed by Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So I think, we have the internal dynamics of that element are not really very much affected by this, except, of course, if we have a total crisis that basically puts these things entirely in the background.
Abdullah Al Shayji.
And I think when you're looking at the situation in South...
Pardon me for interrupting you, Helen. Let's just put that point to Abdullah Al Shayji in Kuwait City. Abdullah, I mean, the prime directive here for the Trump administration is isolate Tehran, isolate Iran. That's a given. But is there a sense in which the allies, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia and Israel, are going to be more isolated because you have the UAE saying, and I quote, "We will not be baited into a conflict," and yet you still have this more provocative tone out of Riyadh?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we have a symmetrical GCC and all other U.S. allies. There is a symmetrical relationship. United States is the dominant, the only hyperpower in the world, and all its allies are just followers at the end of the day, rather than on equal footing with the United States. So it's not only the GCC little countries, but it's also all other countries, even in NATO. I mean, Trump keeps lecturing. Even Germany, major powers, even England, even France. This is a problem with the United States at the end of the day. There is no clear, comprehensive, strategic approach to the regional problems and crises. And that by itself adds much to the trust deficit that the United States allies are witnessing now vis-a-vis the United States. What is the comprehensive strategy? Now, after 13 months, Iran is not budging. Iran is more defiant than ever. The U-turn that President Trump did in the last second, on the last 10 minutes, as he stated, targeting three Revolutionary Guards targets in Iran, has emboldened the Iranians. Iranians now are speaking with a lot of, are boasting about their resistance. They have summoned the Chargé d'Affaires of the United Arab Emirates. Their Revolutionary Guard leaders are now in a very boastful manner, threatening any bullet that will be attacking Iran. We will turn the region upside down, and we will be targeting the American interests. The American interests are widely open. I mean, the bases from Kuwait to Oman are very clear within the Iranian missile sites, and they're also the GCC major installation, whether it's oil, whether it's electric grids, whether it is water, desalination, are all dotted all over the Gulf from Kuwait to Oman. So there is a lot of vulnerability, and the Iranians are playing on this as a deterrence. Now, the deterrence that the Americans were trying to employ against the Iranians have been turned on its head. Now, the Iranians are the ones who are calling the shots in a way, or that's what they think. And this is very dangerous because that will give them more wiggle room to try to do more shenanigans.
Abdullah, I'm going to interrupt you there because we are heading towards the end of our time, and I do want to get in a couple more significant points. Hassan, if we flip around this idea of US allies, there are not necessarily allies in the region, allies of Tehran, but there are historical links. There is a good relationship between Tehran and Oman, but Oman is firefighting its own issues on the back foot, regional issues as well. Would Tehran be open to the idea of talking to its own allies, who could then maybe communicate with Donald Trump?
Well, I think Iran has made it clear that it's open to talk to anyone, but it has also been clear on the fact that it won't, surrender, so to speak. It won't give up any of its, powers, sources within Iran and in the region. The basic argument is that we've embarked on a negotiation with the world community, and the result was the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. The United States didn't respect its own, didn't observe its own obligations within the JCPOA, and I think that is a very, robust argument here in Tehran that a step back will lead to many more. So, as has been the case for now, the nuclear deal led to U.S. withdrawal and again, more sanctions and more push against the Iranians. So another step would lead to more. So this argument is basically stopping Iran and its allies from, negotiating with an administration that doesn't respect the word that it signed.
Helen Lackner in Oxford, very, very briefly, because we've got about 2 minutes left. Is Donald Trump still on a collision course with Iran? Is he on a collision course with himself if he listens to John Bolton? Because if Donald Trump is tilting the other way, what's the point of John Bolton? And if he doesn't do what John Bolton would like him to do, are his three key allies in the region on a collision course with each other?
Well, I think it's clear that there is increasing disagreements between Trump and Bolton, and one can only hope at this point that Trump will replace Bolton and Pompeo, indeed, by people who are less, involved in basically fanatical anti-Iranian plans, which just are completely ignoring the dangers that these involved. I think this MBS certainly wants to do, would be probably voting with Bolton and Pompeo in this argument. And he definitely wants to do something. But I think what is clear is that, one wonders to what extent, particularly MBS, is aware of his own military weaknesses. The whole Yemen operation demonstrates that the Saudi military aren't exactly the most brilliant and competent in the world. And, if the conflict with Iran develops beyond the occasional airstrike or something else, which is what would happen if it becomes a bigger conflict, I think the various Gulf states will have to be involved. And I think what the previous speakers have spoken about, which is indeed the complete divisions within the GCC, and the fact that Oman certainly would do nothing other than attempt to mediate and try and bring peace. And I suspect that Qatar and Kuwait would also largely try and do the same. So it seems to me that, the current dependence on US strikes is something that will continue unless they get replaced by Israelis, which would, make things even worse. But the Saudis on their own are not going to do anything beyond constant and increasing provocative statements and demands and trying to push the US into deeper involvement.
OK,
And,
Helen, I'm going to have to stop you there because we are properly out of time now. I have to say thank you to all our guests today. They were Hassan Ahmadian, Abdullah Al Shayji and Helen Lackner. And thank you to you too for your company. You can see the show again anytime on the website aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, do check out our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter @AJ Inside Story or tweet me. I'm @PeterDobbie1. From me, Peter Dobbie, and everyone on the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.